Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmadu wa nasalli ala Rasul Kareem. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to this series, Journey of Fiqh. As in the last session, the four methodologies or schools of varying methodologies when looking at fiqh and usul al-fiqh were introduced. That is the Ahlul Hadith, the Ahlul Rai, the Zahiriyya and the Aqliyya. It is something that is agreed upon by all the Imams and all the ulama, that the Quran, other than the Quran, the Sunnah, meaning the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, is a primary source in Sharia. That it's a primary source from which rulings are taken for the believers and how they should act in their lives. So there's no disagreement, there's no argument regarding the Sunnah and Hadith being a prime source amongst the ulama of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'at. As for who has how much hadith, so if we look at the era of the Tabi'een, which is sort of a precursor, and it is a precursor to the madahib, the schools. Historically, there were two schools amongst the Ahlul Sunnah when it came to dealing with hadith. The Imams, of course, they would differ in the amount of hadith that each one can accumulate or memorize or learn. And so, as mentioned right early on, it was mentioned that in this era, the era of the Tabi'een, broadly two schools appeared. One was the Hijazi school and one is the Iraqi school. And these two schools have different amount of hadith. And the Iraqi school or the Kufan school was the Kufi school, is known to have less hadith than the Madinah school. The Madinah Muwarrah, because majority of Sahaba lived in Madinah Muwarrah. Their children, grandchildren lived in, stayed and settled in Madinah Muwarrah. Hence, the access to the hadith was more, and also the authentication process of that was, because it's an established society from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was Darul Khilafah for so long, for decades, and the who's who of the community of these cities. This city is known. And the reliability, unreliability. So there's a chain there that was maintained from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Hence, a larger portion of hadith was available, and therefore the reliance on analogy, qiyas, was required less, because you don't need to rely on qiyas analogy on authentic hadith and Quran. Of course, analogy qiyas means that you look into, if there's no hadith or ayat, you look into a ruling that is already there in the Quran Sunnah, see if they're similar or the same, then the same ruling is passed that for that thing. Like for example, a certain type of drug or a drink or intoxicant maybe invented, that its name never existed in history. The way you consume it is never known in history. Then how can you say it's haram when there's no ayat of Quran, there's no hadith? So qiyas will be employed, where you look at other things that are in the Sharia that are forbidden, like alcohol, like wine. Based on that, this is a very simple example of analogy being utilized. So, but the people of Madinah Munawwarah, they had less requirement to do this because they had such a large amount of hadith available to them. While the people in Kufa, in Iraq, they had lesser access to science, the number of hadith. We're talking about the generation of Tabi'een. They had less access to that. And because they had less access to that, they employed qiyas, which is based on the Quran, based on the Sahih or the authentic hadith. And they were less likely to use khabar, ahad, or narration that came from one narrator. So someone turns up and narrates a hadith. And especially if the hadith were not something that should be well known, something that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that happened every day, for example, in the masjid during Fard Salat, but it was not known to any of the, only one person's. How is it possible only one person knows about this thing? So there were more, they relied less on the Ahlul Hadith scholars, which were mainly based in Mecca and Medina, in Hijaz. They had more stronger reliance on hadith and the athar, the narrations of Sahaba radiallahu anhum, and less reliance on qiyas. It took a second place to hadith. While the the Ahlul Rai, which is what they came to be known. Rai means an opinion. I've translated as rationalist or principlist. Like the Rai, the opinion that is based on sound principles and so forth, but maybe not necessarily directly in the text of the Quran and Hadith. So they had a lesser reliance on Hadith than the Ahlul Hadith, and they had depended strongly on qiyas, on analogy. This qiyas is not just an empty opinion or someone feels like, no, it's strongly based with strong principles based on the Quran and Hadith. And this, but if you see by the time it gets time of tabi'in and beyond that, they sort of dissolve. This difference between the two schools dissolves. It's not as prominent as it was in the early era. And the reason for that is, although the name continues and people do utilize it, but the reality is that if you see those who came and studied in the Iraq schools, they also came to Hijaz and they amalgamated and synthesized these schools. So you'll see like Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullah alayhi, who is in Iraq, right? He comes and studies in Hijaz and all over the Arabian Peninsula and beyond, right? And you see he's born in Baghdad and he comes. If you see Imam Muhammad bin Hassan Shaybani, Imam Abu Yusuf, they come and study Imam Malik, the Imam of the Ahlul Hadith and the Imam of the Darul Hijrah of Madinah Muwarrah, the most senior alim Masjid Nabawi. And you'll see like Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayhi, that he studies in Iraq and he studies in. So by that generation, you'll find by the Imam Hanifa students and the other Imams that this difference is less prominent and it's more a synthesis of this. Especially Imam Shafi rahmatullah alayhi, Shaykh Taha Karan from South Africa, that he explained his talk about the Shafi and development Shafi. He was someone who systemized usul of fiqh and also synthesized the Hijazi and the Iraqi schools into what is known as a Shafi madhab. The other difference between this school is that the Ahlul Hadith will prefer even the Hadith that is narrated by one person, and they don't look at anything else. If the chain of the narration is established, that this is an authentic Hadith, it's Sahih Hadith, so they will that Hadith is worthy of being applied, practiced, and you build fiqh on that, rulings upon that. However, the Iraqi school, again, they will not single narrator. They will not. They will be very careful in how they approach a person who, and especially in those things that were unavoidable, that was common amongst what's called umum al-balwa, or that is unavoidable. So especially issues, for example, like as I mentioned before, that something that there should be many hadiths about this. But one person turns up, he says that, and the other nobody else has mentioned anything about this specific act of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they will look at it, you could say suspiciously, or they'll be very careful in applying that hadith and passing a ruling that this is something to be done. The third school or attitude or school of fiqh methodology is the Zahiriyah. It means the literalists. They limit the rulings only to the apparent or explicit text of the Quran and Hadith and reject qiyas and the narration of Sahaba radiallahu anhum. So Imam Juwayni rahmatullah alayhi, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah's teacher, Imam al-Haramain, he said that this is a bid'ah. This is a school that has appeared after Sahaba tabi'in, tabi'in. Imam Dawood bin Ali al-Zahiri rahimahullah was a great Imam. The Zahiris cannot be considered a school that is like, or as he said this is a bid'ah, innovation. Not bid'ah in the sense of this is a bid'ah in aqidah, or is one of the 73 sects that are out of 72 sects that are out of Islam that are going to Jahannam. But when it comes to fiqh, this is not a reliable school. Imam Dawood bin Ali Zahiri rahimahullah was Imam Shafi rahimahulah's student, and he adopted this view. And he had a view that qiyas, analogy, should be obvious. So ambiguous or hidden qiyas, like subtle qiyas, he rejected. The great reviver of this school, you could call him Ibn Hazm, rahimahullah, from Spain, he took this to the next level. He rejected qiyas outright. He rejected any implicit understandings that can be gained from the hadith. He was literally a literalist. And he was more than even Dawud. Even he differs from Dawud al-Zahiri, the founder of this school, to the point of where he went even more further. He used to debate with the ulama, and his book is one of those books that is well known, but is considered not to be read by students, especially in their early. He's very disparaging of the other schools and the imams of the other schools. Many of the attitudes of the Zahiri school do exist in certain people. The mindset does exist. It's not that it's totally extinct. The ideas do pop up their head. Some people look at deen in a very literal sense. That will always exist. People will come up every now and then who will not have a nuanced understanding of, I hate that word because it's used so out of context and so out of Sharia that people use an excuse to make haram halal and so forth. But there are nuances historically in fiqh, and he was, for example, like he even rejected mafhum al-mukhalafa, which is basically negative reasoning. So, for example, Rasulullah ﷺ mentioned in the hadith that when water reaches a certain amount, then if najasa falls in, it doesn't become dirty. Qullatan is a certain amount of water, body of water, right? Now, him saying that automatically implies, it's not said there, that if it's less than that najasa falls in, that's not what they say. If it reaches more than this, then from that you understand the reverse order as well, right? You understand the reverse order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that if the water is less, then it does become dirty if najasa falls into it. But that's not what it says. So this type of deriving rulings from the opposite, right, is something normal. The ulama utilize this, but he even disallowed this as well. So generally, this school is a historical school that became extinct, and it's not something that it's there in the books. We do study it in madaris and so forth. The views do pop up every now and then, and we look at it. But usually, a refutation comes along with it when it contradicts the mainstream schools. Also, they have a view that where they follow the istishab, which is that a presumption of continuity. Meaning that if there's no ruling that came for it, then it's permissible. Because you need to establish, so that because they're literalists, first they've excluded a lot of things. Then if anything comes up in life, this is permissible unless we know there's a direct ruling for it. So you can see the problems that'll be created. The fourth school is the aqliya, or the followers of personal opinion, and that's what I call it. Literally, they're like the people who worship intelligence, their own aql, put it that way. And in Urdu, is a nice word for aql parast type of view. And they're the heirs of the Mu'tazila. Now, Mu'tazila was a sect that appeared due to the study of Greek philosophical books. So the Muslims when the first Greek philosophy was translated into Arabic, some Muslims took upon themselves, they studied it, but what they did was they started applying the Greek philosophical principles to Islamic aqidah and so forth. So you had sort of groups, and this is one of the first groups that appeared, and sect that appeared, and they contradicted totally. So the people who follow this aqliya type school, they worship their own aql, they neglect the hadith totally narrated by one narrator, and they try to always diminish the hadith and the status of the hadith as being a proof. And they'll say statements like these hadiths are just historical events. Like they'll take it out of the category of ahkam, put it in the chapter of history. This is part of history. There's no rulings, there's nothing for us to practice here. Na'udhu billah. And this is a call towards really destruction of the Sharia and destruction of deen. So today you have these type of people appear in different shapes and forms, especially through Orientalists, those who study with Orientalists. They study in non-Muslim universities, or they study in un-Islamic ways. Like in Islamic, they don't study a traditional syllabus or traditional books. They study in Western institutions. They come up with these type of because their aql is, your own personal aql is prized, and in the traditional institutes and madaris, what is prized is naql, understanding of the text of the Quran and the Sunnah. And they also focus on reliance on what is perceived as beneficial, and therefore the preference given to rationalism and benefit over the text of the Quran Sunnah. So they will look at what is benefit, how we can achieve benefit and avoid harm in the context and society that we live in. And then what we'll do is, even though there's a direct Quran and ayat Quran, a ruling and a order from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they will ignore that in trying to achieve that worldly benefit or that worldly to avoid that worldly harm. So this is a invalid methodology, and because as Muslims the rope of Allah and to hold on to the Quran and the Sunnah as we've been ordered, that is for us, that's supreme. And it doesn't matter what public benefit, social benefit, community benefit, the first and primary thing is the Book of Allah, and along with that is the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The next slides, if we look at them, it shows you just quickly. If you go through each of these slides, you see the various views represented visually, that where their leanings are where their emphasis as a methodology lies. So, in the next slide is a topic that needs we'll cover this week and in this session and in the next session as well. The differences of the ulama. One of the sisters sent a question: if the Quran is one, and our Prophet ﷺ is one prophet, we don't have two prophets, we have one prophet. We believe in all the other prophets, but we have one prophet that we follow. How can there be differences? How can there be ikhtilaf? And so Shaykh Aamir Bahjat, in answering, he said, well, how can you have Imam Madinah Islamic University and Imam Muhammad University? Or how can you have this Darul Uloom or that Darul Uloom? Or this madrasa and that madrasa? And each madrasa has got their own syllabus. There might be overlaps, and they've got their own system, their own scheduling. How is it possible? If you understand the madahib as schools of thought, as schools of fiqh, they are schools, madrasas, they are like universities, then it is understandable that there will be differences in the way things are understood and done. So, and the differences can be big as well. One imam will say, arrive to a different understanding based on his principles, that this something is mustahab, while the other one might say this is makruh. One will say it's haram, the other one say it's makruh. So the differences can be big sometimes as well. And the origin of this goes back to the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. Actually goes back to the Sahaba and Sahaba radiallahu anhum in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The most famous example the ulama always give is the order Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave, that don't pray Asr until you reach Banu Qurayza. So a siege was to be laid to Banu Qurayza. A fight was about to occur. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not pray Asr until you reach there. Now halfway through, Asr time started, what was known as Asr time. One group said, it's time for Asr. The other group said, no, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One took it literally, said, we have to pray there. So the time for Asr for us is there, to get there. The other group said, no, the time has entered, we'll pray here. So one prayed and one prayed later. And when this came, and both of them, the hadith is sahih, because both of them heard it from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam directly. So there's no question of the hadith. They both heard it with their own ears. Right? You can't say, and both of them are trying to obey Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there's no motive here of not obeying Rasulullah, disobeying Rasulullah. They're trying to get out of. Both of them want to obey. One said, no, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was trying to hasten us to go quickly. The other one said, no, we have to pray there only. When it was brought back to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and presented, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't censure anybody. Obviously, the right one is one, but from these two groups. And the one who made a mistake or whose ijtihad was not correct is excused, and he'll be rewarded for it because he tried to do the right thing. So this difference is understood, that in understanding the text, right, there could be differences in the way it's understood. So these differences are quite early. It's a normal thing. A lot of Muslims seem to think that the whole world has to do the same thing at the same time. And we all have to do the same thing. And all the imams have to know. They understood the thing. If I hold something in front of you, and one person's sitting there, brother's sitting there looking at it, and a brother's sitting there looking at it, we're looking at the same thing. Right? If I hold a piece of paper or anything, just hold it. You're looking at the same thing, but each one's got a different perspective. He's seeing a different thing, even though they're looking at the same thing. So same thing with the madahib. They have a different perspective and views of when they look at the Sharia and the Quran and Sunnah. And based on that and that angle of approach and the principles that they have, then there will be differences in what is understood from what the text says. But if you look at it, more than 95% of the things, amazingly, despite the differences, come out to be the same. So there's more similarities than there are differences. What are the causes? What is the cause for the differences? Number one, there's two different sources of the causes of the difference of opinion amongst the ulama. The first is the difference in the validity of the dalil, or in the validity of the deduction. So the difference is this hadith valid? So the ulama can differ, this is valid, not valid. Like ulama will differ. This is not sahih. One alim will say sahih, the other sahih. No, I checked the chain, like his chain that he has, and I have a question mark because of the memory of this person, or whatever it is, whatever the reason may be. Right? So there's a difference in the validity of the dalil, and also the validity of the deduction, what is deduced from that dalil. So this is one difference. The second type of difference imams have is the proof, a difference in the proof being used as evidence and its understanding that is derived from that. So regarding the first one, the dalil didn't reach the alim. It's possible that dalil has not reached the alim to form. And this, if you go back to right up to Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, Sahaba radiallahu anhu, that he gave a judgment regarding the inheritance of a grandmother. And when he was correct, it was mentioned to him that many Sahaba mentioned, no, Rasulullah said to give 1/6 of inheritance to the grandmother. Then he backed down, and he said, now the hadith reached him and he changed his view. Or the hadith that mut'a, temporary marriage, was at a certain point allowed, then it was forbidden by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ironically, the hadith narrated by Ali radiallahu anhu, that it was forbidden. And then it didn't reach some people in time. And it's possible because rulings came at different times, and then a previous ruling was cancelled or abrogated or restricted, when the rulings did reach them, then they changed their ruling accordingly. Based on information they had, they gave a ruling. However, a student of knowledge should not be hasty and make assumptions about the imams. The reason, like for example, a hadith on a certain masala, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal who knew a million hadiths by heart, and say, oh, this hadith didn't reach Imam Ahmad. No, Imam Ahmad is narrated in his book, in his musnad. But for a specific reason, like for example, the hadith on tanning leather, he did not consider that haram animal that is carrion, that is not killed in halal way, its leather being is ever purified. Now, there is a hadith that he considered more authentic than what the other three imams of the four madhahib, they considered. So he has a specific reason why he didn't apply this hadith. Or someone came to Imam Malik rahmatullah, why don't you follow this hadith? He says, listen, I know the hadith on this while you were still playing in Baqi', in the graveyard of Qabristan, the graveyard of Baqi', you were still a child and you're playing there, I knew the hadith. But for a certain meaning, based on other hadiths and understanding of the Quran, he has devised a different ruling, came to a different conclusion. Or someone came to him and he said that, why aren't you practicing this hadith? And he said that so people, ignorant people like you can know, and then he explained. So people that, even Imam Ahmad, people didn't leave alone. Imam Malik didn't leave alone. So the proof was not, number one, the dalil might not have reached the Imam when he formed the ruling, or the proof was not valid according to him. He did not consider that a valid proof because there was other hadith or other understanding based on the light of the Quran hadith. The proof was not authoritative according to the alim, that this is authority enough, strong enough, based upon which a ruling can be made. So this is regarding the proof. It's the validity of the proof and the validity of the deduction made from that proof was not considered strong enough that a ruling can be made, and chose to make a different ruling. Now someone becomes a student of knowledge, someone is trying to go deep into knowledge, has a superficial understanding of these imams and their understanding of hadith. So if you look at the understandings of the early imams, so Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi, was reading Ibn Abdul Barr rahmatullah alayhi's commentary on Tamheed. Tamheed is a commentary on Muwatta Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi. He wrote the commentaries, he wrote two commentaries on it, Al-Istizkar and Tamheed. But it took him 30 years of work he did on the Muwatta, and he was a genius, considered the Imam of the East and the West of that time. one of the greatest muhaddithin we had in this ummah. And he said it took him 30 years he's invested into understanding the hadith of Imam Malik rahmatullah alayh. So think of how much work. So now some person who just entered madrasa, just entered into Islamic university, and they will pass judgment on the previous imams and their understanding of the hadith. And they make assumption. This is a very risky thing, not to make an assumption. There might be, the reason might be that the hadith is abrogated in their view, or that he can see some flaw in the chain of narrations based on information that he's got about the narrators, that the other narrators are more stronger, or that there is a specification like this hadith is restricting a previous ruling, giving more details, right? So there's a lot more. These imams have a more deep understanding of what's going on, and then they form the view, not just on the assumption. We have the assumption that the hadith didn't reach them. So people who make that claim willy-nilly, like, so he didn't get hadith, Imam Hanifa didn't get the hadith, Imam Shafi didn't get the hadith, so Imam Ahmad didn't get the hadith. We're jumping the gun. So one has to be very careful in forming a judgment about the imams, why they formed the view that they had regarding a certain issue. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them on behalf of them with the best of rewards. May Allah give us tawfiq to follow in their footsteps. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.